Good thing nothing's in this box right at the moment. But alright guys, I've got another unboxing for Warcaster Neo-Mechanika for you. Welcome everyone. If we haven't met before, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. And right here, this is the empty shell of the box for the third faction from Warcaster Neo-Mechanika. I'm going to butcher the title, but I'll try to pronounce it anyway. The Aeternus Continuum. This is the starter set for that particular faction, and this is not a Kickstarter version. So I bought this one from my local game store. So we'll kind of take a look at what's inside here, see how it compares with, say, a Kickstarter version of the game, and then I'll assemble the miniatures. And while I'm doing that, I'll give a quick recap of the game itself. But now that I've played about a half a dozen battles of Warcaster Neo-Mechanika, I'll give some of my thoughts on the game, and we'll go from there. So let's see what's inside. So we'll get to the miniatures here in a little bit. There's number 4. There's number 4. But this is the biggest difference from the Kickstarter set. There are 4 units in this box, whereas Kickstarter came with 5. It came with 2 copies of one of the solos, and this time you only have 1 copy of the solo. Also, in the retail version of the sets, you do not have the miniature gates. So the pewter gate models, they do not come in the retail version as well. You just have the ones that are part of the token sheet. And we'll get to all that in a minute. So of course you got your rule book. This is the same thing as the Kickstarter. It's got a little bit of the story behind the game, as well as your basic rules of how to play Warcaster. Here we go. We've got your stat cards here. Now there's some interesting details about how these compare to the Kickstarter, so we'll talk about that in a bit. But there, once again, your Warcaster stat cards. You have your Monster Apocalypse style of dice. And then you also have your cards here for your cipher racks. You can play those throughout the gameplay. We'll talk more about that as well. And then finally, the last thing in here, there we go. Here are your token sheets. So these are all the tokens you need to keep track of what's going on. And instead of the pewter gates like this Kickstarter version has, you just got these 2 standard artwork gates. But they do give you some actual plastic bases to put those on. In the previous video, we took a look at the Iron Star Alliance, who's kind of like the giant empire, the fascist group that runs the entire galaxy. At least they probably are fascist. They usually are in science fiction, aren't they? On the other hand, these guys here, the Aeternus Continuum, are a cult that's basically banned and outlawed, and they launch pirate attacks. So in a lot of ways, these are kind of like the Cricks from War Machine, but they're not undead. So they launch these raids on different planets. They capture people, abduct them, take them into their military, force them to serve, and basically strip the lands for their resources to wage the war for why ever they're fighting. I'm not entirely sure, but that's kind of how these guys are. In terms of gameplay, they have some interesting little tricks they can do. So both their Weaver as well as the Vassal Reavers, wherever the stat card is, it's somewhere around here. They both have little movement tricks. The Immortal Weaver can move extra distance by spiking, and the Vassal Reavers can actually move through terrain and other objects, things like that. The Marauder's a little bit different in that he's a heavy battle armor guy, not a lot of movement crazy stuff going on. But he can potentially act every turn if he's charged, and he also has the ability to potentially inflict a system failure on a Warjack, which can temporarily knock out their ability to fight, in terms of taking out either ranged or melee weapons. Now, Scourge Light Warjack, if you give it the right cortex, and get into the whole movement shenanigans as well, because it can get some extra movement. Also, though, it has the ability to boost up its damage a little bit more than normal when you give it arc, because it can influence the power of the weapons, in addition to giving it extra red attack dice. And also with its Wrecking Claw, it can actually immobilize enemy units. It effectively, what it does, it gives them activation token, taking them out of the ability to activate the next turn, which can be quite deadly. These are the same exact cipher cards that came in all the other starter sets. So now you get to have the fun part where you get to enjoy watching me try to assemble these miniatures without accelerant, because I haven't bought any yet. But while I'm doing that, let me talk a little bit about the game itself in case you're new, and I'll also give some thoughts on the game since, like I said, I've played it a few times so far. Oh, one last thing before I start the assembly process. I have gone through and washed these guys, so I've gotten rid of the mold release on them. So no, I'm not trying to glue guys right out of the mold. That always ends very poorly for Peter. Storyline-wise, Warcaster Neo-Mechanika is War Machine in space. It takes place 5,000 years after the events that are currently going on in the War Machine tabletop miniatures game. That being said, it's not War Machine in space in terms of how it plays. There are certainly some similarities to War Machine. You look at the stat cards, they kind of look the same. We have the same basic stat line: speed, mat, rat, defense, arm, sometimes something else depending on what unit it is. However, the numbers are much smaller. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Now, the game obviously shares a lot with most miniature games. You move guys around the board, you resolve ranged attacks with measuring and rolling dice as line of sight, cover, those kind of basic elements are there. What it does a little bit different than, say, a War Machine is that it brings in elements of Monsterpocalypse. We've already seen the dice, which are Monsterpocalypse style dice, so that's why you have a lot of lower numbers here. There's not like the whole War Machine thing where you roll 2d6 or 3d6 or sometimes 4d6, add up that to some number, subtract whatever. Combat is first a dice-off mechanic. Attacker rolls attack dice, defender rolls their defense dice. You compare the results, determine whether there's hit is not, and then based on the margin of success for the attacker, they're going to get a much more powerful damage roll. Once again, they roll these Monsterpocalypse dice for their damage roll, factoring in a few things like power of weapon as well as how well they succeeded. And you compare that in terms of multiples of the enemy's armor. So for example, if the enemy has an armor of 3, for every 3 strikes you roll on this damage roll, you're going to do 1 wound to that target. And things get violent really quickly. Guys die very fast, even Warjacks. Light Warjacks can often go down very quickly in 1 turn. Maybe if you're lucky, 2 turns. It depends on just how much firepower they take. So don't really get too attached to your units in the battlefield. Fortunately, the coolest aspect about this game is it's not really about killing the enemy force. So much of today's modern miniature games are about building up a powerful army and just delivering tons of firepower and killing the enemy really quickly, that it's kind of taken away a lot of the battlefield strategy. Warcaster brings that back. The other Monsterpocalypse element that's brought into this game is the ability to respawn guys on the battlefield. I mentioned earlier about the gates. These are things you can deploy to the battlefield and then send more units out. So guys that died in previous turns can come back. And through this gate deployment strategy, you go for entire battlefield control. So in the end of the day, you're going to win the game, not based on just wiping out the enemy units over and over again, but how well you take advantage of that to position your units to capture objectives and score points that way. The first couple games I played, I got kicked in the face in terms of casualties. I would kill like 1 enemy unit and I would lose 5 or 6 throughout the game, but that allowed me to actually redeploy my units elsewhere through the gates, gain battlefield control, and dominate and win the game. So keep that in mind. This is not a kill the enemy very quickly game. It is a battlefield control game, and frankly that's really awesome. Now the last big thing that's War Machine-ish, but not exactly, are arc tokens. So of course in War Machine and Hordes you have Focus and Fury, and arc tokens kind of fulfill that same role, but their mechanics are a little bit different. You can use these things to power up units, so you make your units more powerful when they attack. I mentioned the term charged a few times during this already. That refers to when units have arc assigned to them. Also, when you deploy those gates I just mentioned about, you have to put arc on them, and that arc is then spent to deploy units. So there's another way you can use arc to alter the battlefield. And finally, some of these cipher cards I talked about, keeping arc back to where it's not on the battlefield can make some of those much more powerful. So the thing about arc is, right now, everybody only has 7 arc that's somewhere in the game at a given time. It could be back in your well, where it's not in the battlefield. It could be on units, where it's powering up individual units, or it could be on gates, which is allowing you to reinforce. So this arc management of where it is in the battlefield at certain times is one of the key strategic elements of the game. And depending on who's got the arc right then, they can do cool things, and all sorts of other fun stuff can happen. Now, one big difference is that unlike War Machine, Warcaster does not have an actual Warcaster on the battlefield. You as the commander of the force are sitting somewhere back, like say in a spaceship or command bunker or something like that, and you are the Warcaster commanding the army. That being said, even though you're not on the battlefield where you can be killed and have the game end like War Machine, your influence is still felt. In particular, as I mentioned a moment ago about the arc tokens, that is basically you manipulating your magical energy. And the other way your presence as the Warcaster is felt on the battlefield is through these cipher cards I've mentioned a few times now. These cards can be played at 2 different times during the turn, and they can affect how things play out on the battlefield. Some cards will affect how a unit may act during a turn, or sometimes multiple turns. Other times it lets a unit act out of sequence or act one additional time, maybe make one extra attack. Some things can bring units back to life or recall them from the battlefield. And finally, there's a set of cards called Furies. Furies are devastating attacks that are unleashed through your Weaver miniature, kind of like how an Arc Node would work in War Machine. So now let me talk about some of my initial thoughts about the game, and the big one is it's been a lot of fun to play. If you haven't played Privateer Press games in a while, this would be a good one to try because it is so different. It's also very simple. Frankly, it's not that much more difficult than something like HeroScape. And this is where I kind of go off in a bit of a conspiracy theory-ish direction. So this is me just kind of talking, making stuff up. I have no reason to suspect this is the case. But there are some aspects of this game that are really super simple compared to how, say, War Machine worked. For example, you have melee and range attacks in this game, but there's not a real big distinction between them. There's a few little things. So normally, like when you're in melee in a miniatures game, you can't fire your guns. In Warcaster, you can do that. I could run my Warjack up to you, spear you with my bayonet when I'm firing the assault rifle, and then put my gauze rifle, well, not wrong universe, railgun through your head or something like that. Also, there are several stats, in particular the strength stat on the Warjacks, that are really not used very much in these rule sets. What this is leading me to think is that there's a term you get tossed out when you hear about business development, entrepreneurship, and that's a minimal viable product. The idea of the minimum viable product is you create the basic thing you need to get a good experience, in this case, a fun experience for a tabletop miniatures game, but it doesn't lack all the details and some of the more things you normally would expect that a full features game like, for example, War Machine would have. And that's why I'm thinking that what's in these rule books here is basically like an introduction to Warcaster. And they've done this before. When War Machine first came out, the original starter set had like a poster that had rules on it, and it was not the complete game. I would not be surprised if sometime next year, once they've got this stuff all sorted out in terms of beta and feedback, because in one of the Warcaster Facebook groups, there's a lead designers asking for feedback and various things. We're probably going to see a complete rulebook experience for Warcaster Neo-Mechanika. It's going to be a full-size rulebook with lots of story in it. There's going to be a few extra things. What I think I might see, for example, is there's going to be more differentiation between ranged attacks and melee attacks like War Machine. The one stat that I mentioned a moment ago that's not used very much is strength on Warjacks. And one thing that was in War Machine that's not in this is essentially like the wrestling aspect, where you can grapple with Warjacks and throw them around, pick up guys and throw them. That is something that's not in Warcaster Neo-Mechanika, and that was something that would use the strength attribute. And the Scourge has the ability to actually increase the strength attribute, and that's kind of useless right now, because there's only like 2 Cypher cards that actually affect strength or do something with strength. I think there's 2. It's really a very weird stat. So that's just my crazy crackpot theory anyway. So, whoever thought that a high-end DeWalt drill would be a miniature tool? So you don't actually have to have a drill quite like that. I just have to drill a few holes in the base of the Scourge over here to get its feet pegs in the right spot. And free tip while I'm thinking of it before I take a closer look at the miniatures. At least with the Scourge, I didn't try with the Iron Star Alliance Jack, or maybe also possible Marcher Worlds. You can actually bend the legs a little bit because they're pewter, and that can help you make some minor micro adjustments to get the hips in the right spot to go ahead and glue the torso in. And now let's take a look at these guys, and hopefully they won't fall apart on us. Big emphasis on this guy when it comes to hopefully. So here's the Weaver. She's kind of the spellcaster character. Next up are the Vassal Reavers. This is your unit squad. It's a 3-man squad. Then is the Marauder. He is that heavy infantry guy, battle suit thing that I talked about earlier. And then finally is the Scourge Light Warjack. I equipped him with a rocket pod, a nailer, and a force rod. So he's got 2 shoulder points and 1 arm hard point, plus this giant claw over on the other side. So the last few things I want to talk about here quickly are, I want to compare some of the cards from Kickstarter to the ones that are in the production set. So here is one of the cards from the Kickstarter. It's got the foil text up here in the top. And right next to it is one of the cards from the Kickstarter, from the production unit. The production unit is a lot higher quality. It's got a glossy coat to it, which you can see I see a little bit there as it tilted back and forth, which the Kickstarter one does not. And it's also just got a little bit of higher weight cardstock to it. So it's kind of a shame the Kickstarter one's a little chintzy, but you know, for the weapon cards, the production ones are definitely better than what we got in the Kickstarter. As a comparison also, I want to look at the Cypher cards. This one over here is Kickstarter, this one here is production, and they seem to be basically identical, which is a good thing, because that would be kind of weird if the Kickstarter ones weren't the same, then future updates wouldn't be the same. So these cards are the same, just the foil cards are different than the production ones in terms of quality. Alright guys, well I think that's about it for today's episode, unboxing the new, Aeternus Continuum command group from Warcaster Neo-Mechanika. So once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. If you want to find some more Warcaster content, just go ahead and subscribe to this channel. I've done some speed paints of some of the Iron Star Alliance stuff in kind of an Arctic camouflage look. And I'll put these guys in the queue for painting. Don't know when I'll get to them, but I'll add them to the list. And also, you can find a link in the show notes to the first look that I did with the Iron Star box set, if you were interested in that particular faction. Okay, well, I think that's about it. Oh, the one last thing I just want to touch on, at least as of Tuesday, so this is 2 days after last week's video came out, where I built a hardwood custom cajon. And apparently, if you make a joke in the start of the video about wanting your video to tank, people won't watch past that point. I learned my lesson there. Oh, don't people take my jokes a little too seriously, apparently, because the watch time of that video went south real fast. Also, click-through was crap, too, which is what I was mainly talking about when I was making that joke about watching the video tank, because, you know, woodworking for miniature wargaming guys is probably not going to do very well, but you never know. It's a fun thing to try. So, alright, that's it for this time, so have a great week.